Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the National Reentry Resource Center's webinar on the role of local governments in reentry. This webinar is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, and will discuss the role of local government in reentry, including how local government agencies can establish and sustain reentry efforts and how these efforts affect local budgets. We will also cover resources available for the field, particularly for folks, practitioners and policymakers interested in implementing local reentry efforts. This webinar will feature presentations by Sheriff Andrea Cabral of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, Jesse Janetta from the Urban Institute's Justice Policy Center, and Commissioner Scott Martin from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. After the presentations, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. To ask a question, please type the question in the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. We will do our best to answer your questions, but please understand this is a very large webinar, so your specific questions may not get answered. If you encounter technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Tech Support at 866-229-3239. We understand that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve in time to participate in this webinar. For this reason, we are recording the event and will be posting the recording on our website within the next few days. You can find that at www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. We really appreciate Mr. Janetta, Sheriff Cabral, and Commissioner Martin for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us today. And now, I'd like to turn it over to them. Sheriff Cabral?
Hello and welcome, everyone. Many thanks to Leanne Duran, Sean Rogers, and the National Reentry Resource Center for offering this webinar. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. Hello to my fellow panelists, and let's get started. Reentry is the term we commonly have come to use to describe the process by which criminal offenders are reintegrated back into their communities. Effective reentry programs are critical to any effort aimed at increasing public safety through the reduction of recidivism and productive transition of ex-offenders back into society. From my perspective as a former prosecutor and now a county sheriff, reentry programs can and should be an indispensable and sustainable part of every correction system. Reentry programming begins on the offender's first day of incarceration. These programs and services are particularly effective at the county level, in correctional institutions where the average length of sentence is relatively short and the offender's ties to family and community are not as severely or irretrievably broken by lengthy periods of incarceration. Our correctional institutions are going to have to learn to deal more competently with the 95% of offenders, both state and federal, who were released from custody. In many cases, this involves a fundamental reform of correctional policy, and given widely divergent community and local standards, it's a considerable challenge. However, this is a growing population whose social and economic impact on society becomes more profound every single year. With the exception of those in state or federal prison who are serving life sentences without the possibility of parole or who have been sentenced to death, all incarcerated people will at some point be released. Housing, employment opportunities, and the opportunity to pursue higher education are all significantly diminished for someone with a criminal history, especially if that history includes incarceration. According to a 2008 report by the Pew Charitable Trust Center, there were 1 in 99.1 adults incarcerated in prisons and jails, and that's a little bit over 2.3 million people. And of that number, 794,417 are attributed as being in jails. And it's estimated that there are more than 3,000 jails nationwide. Because the Bureau of Justice Statistics is really, quite frankly, unable to compile actual numbers for the numbers of people in local jails because they're dependent upon that information being sent to them. The estimate is much higher, actually, for people incarcerated in such facilities. Without national leadership on reentry that includes support and funding for initiatives that involve effective collaboration between law enforcement and community service providers, tax incentives for employers to hire ex-offenders, sweeping changes to federal and state drug laws. Recidivism rates are going to stay at more than 50% and will continue to spend more than $49 billion a year on incarceration. In Massachusetts, the county sheriffs lead the way on reentry programs. Of the 14 sheriffs in the Commonwealth, 13 operate county jails and houses of correction. As public officials elected countywide every 6 years, these sheriffs are most knowledgeable about and most closely tied into their communities. County sheriffs in Massachusetts provide mutual aid to state and local law enforcement in the form of task force, gang intelligence, and other intelligence officers. They provide 911 emergency dispatch services and transportation on default sweeps and DUI checkpoints. Because they're so community-based and focused, county sheriffs also create the kinds of partnerships outside of law enforcement that support strong and effective reentry programs. The potential impact of effective reentry programs on the state's cities and towns is very significant, and Massachusetts is a good example of that. Collectively, the sheriffs hold in excess of 70,000 inmates and pretrial detainees in their facilities. Every year, more than 65,000 are released from county jails and houses of correction. By contrast, the State Department of Correction releases just over 3,000 inmates from Massachusetts prisons annually. State prisons release offenders from facilities located in every corner of the state. Some make their way back to their communities and others do not. In Suffolk County, we are one of the largest sheriff's departments in the country with an average daily population of 2,700 inmates and pretrial detainees. By contrast to the State Department of Corrections, the majority of offenders held at county houses of correction hail from neighboring cities and towns, and upon release, return immediately to those communities. In Suffolk County, for example, the House of Correction holds between 1,500 and 1,800 inmates a year, and 95% of them live within 5 miles of the facility. The decisions that newly released offenders make within the first 48 hours of freedom will largely determine whether, if at all, they return to custody within 6 months to a year. The overall goal of reentry programs is to provide support, skills, resources, and more opportunities to make positive choices. Generally speaking, reentry programs should provide the 3 things that I just mentioned, because many offenders, especially those who present with persistent drug and alcohol addictions and have extensive involvement with the criminal justice system, live on life's margins. They have little or no job history, no stable housing, are grossly undereducated, and as an example, approximately 50% of our inmates are high school dropouts. They have suspended or revoked driver's licenses and or no form of state-issued identification. This is also a persistently sick population, presenting with a number of chronic diseases like high blood pressure, diabetes, asthma, HIV, and other sexually transmitted diseases, including hepatitis. There's also a high incidence of mental illness in this population. In this state, sheriffs estimate that approximately 42% of their populations present with some form of mental illness or personality disorder, with approximately 26% presenting with a major mental illness. It's an incredibly challenging population to deal with. And unfortunately, sheriff's departments across the country, and certainly in Massachusetts, have become de facto mental health facilities, principal providers for drug detoxification and substance abuse treatment, and often function as the primary care medical providers for those incarcerated at the county level. At this level, effective reentry programs have 3 essential components. The first is a comprehensive assessment tool. The second is an evidence-based employment and life skill building program that uses community providers and resources. And third, case management and discharge planning. The process of reentry has to begin at intake, and an assessment should be done of every inmate every time he or she is incarcerated. I realize the challenges that presents, especially for smaller departments. All Massachusetts sheriffs classify inmates, and I think this is true across the country, to particular units and programs based on some form of risk versus needs assessment. In Suffolk County, we use 3 assessment tools. 2 of them, the Level Service Inventory Revised, commonly known as the LSIR, and the Adult Substance Abuse Use Survey, the ASUS, are based on national standards. We then created a third just for our internal use. These instruments, which are critical to any kind of programming, they measure education levels, substance abuse history, prior treatment, criminal history, and that includes juvenile history and past institutional discipline, family and marital status, employment history, and mental health history. Service provision and eligibility for certain programs is prioritized according to need, program duration, and the length of the inmate's sentence. We also utilize a number of internal and external case managers. Most are full-time employees who also provide case management for those inmates who enroll in educational, vocational, and substance abuse treatment programs not connected to specific reentry programs. We also have several external case managers who work for specific programs pursuant to state and federal grants. Discharge plans, which vary in content and level of resources depending on the programs in which the inmate participates, are provided to every inmate upon release. And I want to say a quick word about follow-up and aftercare, because while I completely understand, especially in this economy, the challenges to creating and sustaining effective reentry programs, the programs themselves, it is important to mention follow-up and aftercare, because supervision and support are so crucial to successful transition. The follow-up and aftercare component is extremely important. Ex-offenders generally have limited options regarding the environments to which they return post-release. These environments hold all of the negative influences and temptations that contributed to the criminal behavior in the first place. And unfortunately, the cost of incarceration is so high, few institutional programs have the resources to fund these tools. In Suffolk County, our most successful programs all have a follow-up and aftercare component. We rely very heavily on our community partners to provide resources such as mentors, faith-based groups, and relapse prevention programs that support ex-offenders and encourage them to continue making productive and positive life choices. I'm now going to go through some of our programs so that you can see the kinds of partnerships on which they rely, and you'll notice that they literally come from all corners. The first program is called the Common Ground Institute. We call it CGI. As you can see, the program partners the primary partners are the Massachusetts Department of Revenue, the Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicles, and the Gould Construction Institute. And I'll tell you a little bit about this program. It's a skill-based vocational certificate program for inmates classified as low-risk offenders. The program works in conjunction with our department's Community Works program, which is comprised of crews of inmates that perform community restitution on public land and grounds in the form of maintenance, cleanup, and restoration. We started this program in May of 2005, and it completed its 30th cycle in May of 2010. It involves 150 hours of instruction in 4 vocations, and the reason we chose vocations versus academic is because the plain fact is that many people, especially those that have dropped out of high school, at the 9th grade level or the 10th grade level, if not sooner, are very unlikely to go back and get a GED and to move beyond that to some additional education, but people will learn a skill. The 4 vocations are landscaping, ground maintenance, carpentry, and building maintenance. And there's also 15 hours of instruction in occupational safety, or OSHA training. Each cycle is 10 weeks long. The first 5 weeks consist of morning classes in attitude adjustment, job preparedness and training, and then we run concurrently in the afternoon and evenings the competency-based academic training classes in the 4 different vocations. The second 5 weeks provide performance-based training and practical field experience in public buildings and on public land, which also constitutes community restitution, which is very appropriate, especially for this particular population. It also saves cities and towns a great deal of money. We partner with the cities and towns in Suffolk County, most particularly Boston and Revere, and they provide the materials for these crews to use what they've learned on public land, and they provide the work sites for our crews. We also work with the State Department of Revenue in conjunction with this program to resolve outstanding child support issues before inmates are released so that they're not rearrested on outstanding warrants. Because a valid license to drive is also essential for both the job search and many types of employment, we also work with the State Registry of Motor Vehicles to resolve outstanding traffic and parking violations so that inmates who had licenses prior to being incarcerated can have them restored. This program has also recently built a successful relationship with various trade unions, placing 2 former offenders in union jobs just this year. That's a very fertile ground because many of the trades unions do hire ex-offenders as long as they can be somewhat assured that the behavior is not going to repeat itself. Inmate work performance and attendance are regularly evaluated in every cycle. Every CGI inmate must pass a final examination in each academic discipline. Those who fail to attend or perform to standards are simply removed from the program. And upon completion, they're awarded graduation certificates and OSHA-certified safety cards. The OSHA card enables an otherwise qualified ex-offender to secure employment at any federal work site. To mitigate the negative impact of their criminal histories on prospective employment, the department also has an on-staff job placement specialist who recruits employers willing to hire CGI graduates. And even if you can't afford to have an on-staff person who does that, there are lots of community-based programs that can help you. And in fact, there are some that actually do the exact same thing, which is to cultivate a pool of employers who will hire ex-offenders. So in 2006, we became the first correctional facility to be certified by the State Department of Workforce Development as a sponsor of apprenticeship training. So if you graduate from this program in the institution, you receive apprenticeship credits that can be accepted by employers statewide. And I think to date we've placed roughly 250 ex-offenders in jobs with employers who hired even knowing that a person has a criminal history. The next program is called Community Reentry for Women, or the CREW program. I want to say just a little bit about gender-focused reentry programs for women. Incarceration rates for women are rising. We're all kind of seeing it. And at the county level, at least in Massachusetts, their sentences are shorter than that of their male counterparts. Effective reentry programs for women, especially those that focus on attitudinal change, require sufficient time in pre-release so that the full benefits of the program can be realized. And that can be a challenge because, at least as we see it here, women's sentences are shorter. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, reports that 70% of women incarcerated in the United States have experienced either domestic violence or sexual assault before the age of 17. The impact of that trauma on criminal behavior in this population is something that when you're building a program you really have to take into consideration. And that's not to say that there aren't trauma-based behaviors and acting out among the male population, but that's a very interesting and large and significant statistic for the women. In Suffolk County, all of our programming, not just reentry programming for women, is gender-centric. So we took a look before we created the programs at the literature, and we looked at the surveys. We actually surveyed our own female inmates and looked at the research to find out what kinds of programs would be particularly effective for them and better equip them to transition back to their families and communities. And what they told us was actually supported in the literature and the national research. Program components for women that deal with self-esteem, anger, addiction relapse management, and trauma associated with sexual and physical violence are especially important. Unlike their male counterparts, only a very small percentage of female inmates in Massachusetts responded that they enroll in programs to earn credit for time off their sentences. The women appear to participate in programs to discuss the negative experiences in their lives and better understand what drives their behavior. Not surprisingly, their success in these programs, as we've seen it, is closely tied to the relationships they develop with and the support they derive from the program facilitators and each other. So as you can see with the CREW program, there are 3 main partners, and each is designed to get at a specific criminogenic factor, a specific deficit. So Project Place, which is a multi-service center, provides the reentry services, the job readiness, and the life skills instruction. We thought The addition of a community health center, and the South End Community Health Center is excellent here in Massachusetts, was very important because women are the primary caretakers, almost invariably have children, and are the primary caretakers of those children when they're not incarcerated. Their lack of attention to their own health care becomes generational, and their children also suffer from a lack of health care. And so the South End Community Health Center provides us with some very good comprehensive trauma education, mental health, and medical health, and nutrition life skills that allow the female inmate or detainee to establish that relationship while they're in custody with the health center in the hope that they maintain that relationship but also begin to seek the same level of health care for their children once they're released. And obviously the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which helps us with parenting skills. We began training our staff in this program in 2004, and it was initially, this is another good point about grants, this was initially funded by the Department of Education, which gave us a $300,000 grant 3 years in a row. And at some point, the grants do stop, and you have to make decisions about how much of that program you can incorporate into your own budget. This is a very important program to us, so we simply incorporated that into our budget. But it's a good point about grant opportunities. The Department of Labor, the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, there are all lots of federal grant opportunities out there to start a program. And so in this community partnership, our contribution is we provide a mental health clinician, a recovery and substance abuse clinician, and we have 6 trained corrections officers that provide care, custody, and control of the female inmates and detainees in the unit. The crew provides the job readiness, the life skills training, case management, health management, housing, job search assistance, et cetera, to incarcerated women who then transition to the community with the support and supervision of the partners for up to 2 years. CREW is a fairly unique program in that there's a 2-year follow-up and aftercare component to this program. Employment and housing are program priorities. And as you see on this slide, it'll give you some statistics on, for 2009 on outcomes. So 41% were placed in jobs within 3 months of release. With the job retention rates, which we always try to take a look at because we have the follow-up and aftercare component, you'll see that they sort of wax and wane. Within 3 months, 56% were placed in jobs. After 12 months, 39% had remained in those jobs. After 6 months, 44%. The reason it went up is because of a glitch actually in the system that once we transition people into transitional housing, and that transitional housing is up within 6 months, sometimes women become homeless again. And we have to then put them back into the shelter community, and that accounts for the glitch in the numbers. But after 24 months, you see the dip to 23%, and that's not because only 23% remain employed. It's because after those 2 years, we're not able to stay in touch with everybody, and some people simply fall off the radar screen. It doesn't mean that they're not working. It just means that they're not letting us know where they are and what they're doing. And in the housing, you see 66% placed in housing within 3 months of release. 100% are placed in housing within 6 months of release because we get everybody into transitional housing within the first 6 months. And then 66% at 12 months remained in housing. This third program is called, before I go to that, it's important to note, in 2005, only 11% of crew graduates were placed in jobs, and the placement rate has increased by about 30% in 5 years, because one of the things we're able to do with this program is constantly tailor the program curriculum, modify the job readiness workshops, and expand our transitional job opportunities to better meet the needs of the participants. We see a 10% difference in the recidivism rate for our crew graduates versus the national average. So the national recidivism rate is said to be about 30%. For our crew graduates, we see it at 20%. The next program is the Boston Reentry Initiative, and I put this one in because it's, you see the list, it's almost a laundry list of partners. And that has a lot to do with the fact that, like all of our reentry programs, it's targeted toward a specific population. And the population here are inmates whose crimes involve the use of firearms, violence, gang activity, and or drug dealing. They are considered to be the high-impact players. They have extensive criminal histories, have done time before, and in fact, their time in the House of Correction is likely to be the last time they'll see the inside of a county facility. Their next incarceration will be either in a federal penitentiary or in state prison. It's a population that's considered to be 100% likely to repeat their behavior. And without intervention and upon release, these are the inmates that are most certain to have a negative impact on any community to which they return. So what you see here is, in addition to the Sheriff's Department, the Boston Police, the United States Attorney's Office, the Department of Probation, Parole, the Department of Revenue, the DA's Office, community providers like Youth Opportunity Boston, the Whittier Street Health Center, the Dorchester Bay Economic Development Corporation, a consortium of African American clergy known here as the 10-Point Coalition and the Nation of Islam. And it's very much a carrot and stick program. So eligible inmates are identified within the first 45 days of their sentences. And every month, panels of 12 inmates are oriented to the BRI and are told of the significant consequences of any post-release criminal conduct. But they are then offered rehabilitative programs and support and services that will enable them, if they stick with the program, to make better choices when they are released. And post-release, they're provided with follow-up programs, services, mentors, and support. In fact, one of the components of this program is that the mentors, when they are released, come to the facility in the morning, literally pick them up, because everyone who's in one of our programs has a discharge plan with the follow-up they're supposed to do with local service providers and such, and their mentors literally pick them up and make sure that they're being taken to the places they need to go to do the follow-up they need to do, and that's our way of having an impact in this population on those decisions they make within the first 48 hours. The BRI statistics we compile by calendar year, and so since its inception, we've had 1,520 men participate in the program, and in calendar year 2009, 245 male inmates, each of whom was considered 100% likely to reoffend, participated in the BRI program. You see, these statistics, I can tell you that we've been able to measure consistent results every year since the inception of the program, so we've gotten consistent results to these statistics in 2005, 2006, 2007, and 2008. This is actually a fairly remarkable thing. There's 161, or 66%, have remained arrest-free, or have been arrested, if they were rearrested, on minor or non-serious charges, and we define that as a charge not involving violence or a weapon. 46% have been arrest-free for a year or more. 2%, or 6, were rearrested on more serious or violent charges. 8% were rearrested on similar charges to those that brought them to the House of Correction to begin with. And 2, or 1%, of the total group is deceased. And the last two I'll go through very quickly are sort of catch-all programs, offender reentry programs for adult male offenders and the Women's Resource Center. And they really show partnership with local service providers and community-based organizations, and also the colleges. The colleges are a great resource. Whether you have people coming in providing mentorship, teaching classes, or instructors that will come in and provide specific course instruction for some of your reentry programs, it can be among the least expensive things to do. Some will put it in their own budget and won't actually look to contract with you to provide any money for those services. But they can be pretty consistent. The colleges and universities are a consistent source. And so this program provides life skills, GED, literacy classes, computer and job placement for male and female inmates. And what we've been able to measure is that those that participate in this program are 13% less likely to be arrested after incarceration versus those who don't participate. Our rearrest rate thus far is 28% compared to 48% for those that don't participate in the offender reentry program and who are not enrolled in other SCSD programs. The last thing I'll talk about is halfway houses. Halfway houses offer really great opportunities for good community-based partnerships. So we have two. We have the Brook House for men and the McGrath House for women. There are 45 male inmates classified to the Brook House, and we use that as a step-down facility for many of the male inmates who go through our other programs, and we use the McGrath House as a step-down transitional housing facility for some of the women that go through the crew program. And you can see one of our partners is Community Resources for Justice. This is an example of a not-for-profit organization that provides a good, solid partnership with the County Sheriff's Department to work with these adult offenders and provide the services and support to them as they're transitioning back into their communities. We also work with the trial court in Massachusetts and the Department of Probation and the Massachusetts Department of Parole. We also, as sort of a supplement, we make sure that our community supervision unit, which are trained deputy sheriffs that work out in the field, take responsibility for the day-to-day supervision of these pre-release inmates that are classified to halfway houses. The deputy sheriffs they know the communities very well, and they work very closely and effectively to make sure that pre-release inmates are working or participating in programs as they're supposed to do. So these are just some examples of reentry programs that involve and are dependent on sustainable partnerships between corrections, first responder law enforcement agencies, not-for-profit organizations, state agencies, federal agencies, parole, probation, colleges, and volunteers. In every community, there are at least a few of these potential partners and law enforcement agencies, whether they focus on corrections or frontline law enforcement, can really be good primary partners and the drivers for creating and sustaining them. I know resources are an issue, as I said before, but even a small pilot program with solid law enforcement and community partners can be very effective. Don't miss the opportunity to look at local foundations for grants, state agencies, and even at the federal level. Call around to local service providers. Even your state or local health commissions can be helpful to you in providing some support and some service provision. Meet with people, see what resources already exist that you can already tap into, so it's not going to be a further drain on your budget. And if you're brand new to this, you don't have to start big, but it is important to start. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Sheriff. That was a very in-depth presentation, and I think it definitely paints a picture of what a lot of us are facing throughout the country. I know here in Lancaster County facing the same way, a lot of the same issues, and I can especially appreciate how a lot of our facilities are turning into basically mental health dumping grounds from a certain standpoint and becoming mental health facilities with the closing of a lot of state hospitals around here. But my program will be a little more shorter and sweeter, really talking about the role of local elected officials in reentry. And first and foremost, with the first slide that I have, really it's about a partnership. Reentry cannot just be done by the executive branch. It cannot just be done with the Sheriff's Department or not necessarily just with the courts. But it involves many different entities being on the same page, kind of basically rowing the boat in the same direction in order to really reach the individuals you're trying to serve and integrate them back into the community and prevent them from coming back. First and foremost, having county government involved, I know it may vary slightly from state to state in the various functions they may have, but for the most part, you need to have all your human service organizations at the table. You need to have your drug and alcohol commissions, your mental health, mental retardation organizations, your children and youth agencies, your employment and training agencies, or workforce investment boards. You have to have your courts involved. Obviously, those them being the ones that sentence individuals, and then when people leave prison, many times are under supervision of probation departments. The ability to have them at the table is a critical component of reentry. And then also your prison, not only your prison boards, but your prison staff. A lot of people understand that sometimes there's a selling point to participating in these reentry programs. I like the analogy that the sheriff used as far as the carrot and the stick, but you definitely dangle the carrot even as they're coming down to their last maybe few weeks that they're sitting in your county prison before they're released. The ability to have the prison to allow individuals to come in from the outside to basically sell the various reentry initiatives that you have going on to really pique the interest of your offenders, that they'll participate in them for their own good, to help change their lives and help to stabilize them. And then finally, outside of the government realm, it's very important to get a lot of your social service groups and your faith-based organizations involved. I know here, at least in this part of Pennsylvania, here in Lancaster County, we have a very strong contingent of faith-based groups where they have women's shelters or women's homes or deal with certain types of addictions, get them involved in their church, mentoring, things of that nature. And we all know that there was typically a lot of various social service groups that are looking to be a part of the efforts. So those partnerships are critical in order to have a successful reentry program. And as county commissioners or those who head your prison board, you're to be the ones that will be, I'll use the term cheerleader, in bringing those people to the table in order to get it started is a very critical component. Now, like anything that we do in county government, it really starts on the board level as far as setting the tone, setting policy as to what direction you want to head in. Here in Lancaster County, I know when we came into office, we were faced with a tremendously growing prison population. The sheriff hit it right on the head as she talked about just the rapid increase in females entering into the system. But you have to basically set a policy that you want to work with those who you're able to work with, those that are not an imminent threat to the community, not the violent offenders that I know sometimes that the community worries about. Set the policy that you're going to have your full county resources into this, and that your goal is to treat this as secondary prevention, as I like to term it. You want to, we didn't get it the first time, but hopefully the second time, to prevent these individuals from coming back into your doors, and to set a policy from the top and set everyone on the way is a good way to start. But it does take a lot of advocacy, as I mentioned before. Sometimes in certain jurisdictions you have to be careful. Probation and parole, who also is in charge of basically overseeing individuals once they're in the community, they tend to do their own assessments. They tend to have visitation. They tend to try to follow through to make sure people are going to their appointments. So having a relationship between your reentry management groups and the courts, specifically probation and parole, is very critical so that they're on the same page. Here, one of the big initiatives we've had, at least over the last year and a half, is that we're really looking at the assessments that are done, and so we're not really trying to duplicate where you have the prisons doing an assessment, probation and parole is doing an assessment, then you have the reentry groups doing an assessment, and sometimes they're all different and they speak different languages. How can you do a better job of everyone's reading the same materials and know exactly what it means, and maybe only having to do it once? That's something that definitely could be a benefit from that. As far as advocating for state government or federal government, as the sheriff mentioned, especially as of late with a lot of the ERA funding that was out there was the ability to apply for various reentry grants through, I believe, the Second Chance Act, which was passed not too long ago. I believe it's going through its second round of funding. So there are opportunities out there. Various foundations. Sometimes you may also find that there's various church or faith-based organizations that also want to contribute, whether it's in-kind contributions towards the efforts or sometimes the monetary value. But the big one that I think is changing community perception. It's very easy, and anyone's ever gone through anything that has to do with prison-related things in the community, whether it's zoning or where you're going to put a type of facility. Sometimes it's probably the biggest case of NIMBY that any of us will really face. It's very important for elected officials, especially in this economic environment, to really sell what the benefits are of what we're trying to do. Yes, it's trying to change lives, but in the end, we're also trying to save the taxpayers that we all serve money, their tax dollars, and that the benefit of keeping this, stopping this revolving door of people coming into our system is one of the most critical challenges we're going to face as a country moving forward. And when you really tend to talk about the economic impact, you really tend to talk about the changing of lives, that tends to get more people's attention. It's always very important to stress that in most reentry programs you are not dealing with violent offenders, that most violent offenders are serving serious time, many times ending up in state facilities, and those that are in your county prisons that are awaiting trial are not participating in reentry programs. Just some of the little tidbits that been pushed back at us over the years. But you as an elected official are a voice for programs such as this, and being that it works, we have seen an absolute where we saw a tremendous increase in our prison population prior, almost to the point of having to build a $170 million facility. We have now seen a leveling off of our population as far as new admissions, and we're looking to expand that as well. Instead of building that $170 million facility, we're looking to build something not expensive as hard cells, but more of a dormitory-style community corrections and reentry center that's more focused on jobs, job skills, and also the various programs that reentry brings to the table. Whether it's helping people to reapply for some of their lost benefits, from when they first became incarcerated, to dealing with housing and various options that may be out there. So all kinds of things can be done in a facility such as this, and like I said before, building these types of facilities compared to hard cells are definitely an advantage. And I really believe it's going to be a trend. I think even here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, who's currently undergoing the construction of 3 new penitentiaries, they're basically talking about now the importance of people on the back end of their sentences being phased back into their communities through programs such as the one that we're talking about here. And finally, I wanted to talk about accountability in your program. Just like everything else that we do, we all want to see measurable results. And yes, one very obvious result is obviously recidivism rates are a good measuring stick, and what your daily population averages are at your county prisons. But we have chosen here for accountability purposes is when our reentry group puts out RFPs for various reentry services, we make it competitive. We believe that competition really breeds a lot of quality, and some of the projects that we have come through here have tended to be so far, knock on wood, maybe 3 years into it now, have been very successful. And like a lot of the other reasons why we put out competitive bids, we believe that doing it in this area as well, if you have enough of those type of organizations in your community, can also breed you results too. But I guess to sum it all up, to be a big cheerleader for it, because reentry does work, and once you try it, if you have not tried it at this point, you will absolutely see a result that will very much be in the favor of not only changing lives but saving tax dollars. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being here.
Thank you, Commissioner Martin. With that, we're going to turn it over to Jesse Donato from the Urban Institute.
Hello, everyone. I want to as well thank the Council of State Governments, the National Reentry Resource Center, and my fellow panelists. My role in this webinar is to talk a little bit about some resources that are available to the field in general and thinking through reentry. It's a little daunting to have that role in a webinar being sponsored by the National Reentry Resource Center, which I would say is probably the best, by a long ways, clearinghouse of information and resources having to do with all aspects of reentry. And so in many ways, probably the most useful thing I can do is encourage everyone to turn back and go to the National Reentry Resource Center and see what they have available in terms of information and guidance for the field. What I'm going to talk specifically about are some resources and efforts related to the transition from jail to the community initiative, of which I am co-director along with Kermit Humphreys at the National Institute of Corrections. TJC was initiated by NIC. It's sort of a a younger sister project to the Transition from Prison to Community initiative, which has been going on since the year 2000, and NIC decided to do a parallel project having to do with reentry from local jail facilities. At the urging of their jails division, a lot of the information base and resources having to do with reentry tends to be focused on people coming back from state and federal prison, which of course is a very important issue, and you have often much more serious offenders coming back from prison. But in terms of numbers and community impact, across the United States, you're looking at on the order of 700 to 750,000 people a year coming back from prisons, whereas it's much closer to on the order of 9 or 10 million individuals a year walking out of the doors of local jails. So in terms of raw numbers, the jail issue really dwarfs the prison issue. I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways in which many of the principles that I'm talking about, the other panelists are talking about, are equally relevant to both, particularly when you look at it from the local level. So the NIC and the Urban Institute worked together to develop the TJC model to try and gather up all the pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, what makes a good jail transition system. And then the next step of the project was to take it out and test and ground truth that model in actual jurisdictions. So we've been working with Douglas County, Kansas, and Denver, Colorado as learning sites since September of 2008. And then just a year ago, we brought on La Crosse County, Wisconsin, Orange County, California, Kent County, Michigan, and Davidson County, Tennessee. And we've been working with them for a year. But of course, when you think about all the local jurisdictions that run jail systems, 6 is just a drop in the bucket. So really, in order to attempt to make broad impact, we've been working on how to take what we're learning from the sites and make it available to everyone who wants to think through how to do good jail transition work. And I'll talk about some of the resources we have for that at the end. But we've got the web link for our implementation toolkit, which is the hub of the information that we put together in that line. So I want to show you real quickly, this is the transition from jail to community model that we put together, and it has 2 levels, one at the system level and one at the individual intervention element level. Many of the things at the individual level tie very nicely with what Sheriff Cabral was talking about, which is not surprising because looking at what they're doing in Suffolk County was one of the key sources from which we drew in putting together this model. But it really looks at the individual level, doing screening and assessment to understand who in your jail is at the highest risk of returning, to see what your targets of change are, what you would need to change with those individuals in order to keep them from coming back, embodying that in an actual plan for what you're going to do, and then bringing targeted interventions to bear and thinking about that as a continuum from, really small things like just giving them information about resources in the community and referrals to things that are much more intensive like case management and formal services and what have you. But equally, if not more important in doing good jail transition are these things that are at the system level that include leadership, that include building a collaboration so that you have joint ownership across stakeholders, putting data into it and making sure you're evaluating what you're doing and sustaining it over the long term. Really what you want to do is build a system so that these things you're doing at the individual level, you're not swimming upstream, but you're actually going with the flow of what the system that you've established is attempting to do. One thing that you may notice about this model is that it's in some ways at a pretty general level, and one of the reasons we did that is that we wanted to put together a model that takes into account that's going to be equally applicable in the very different jail systems around the country in terms of size and what have you. So we wanted to have one that would travel and have applicability. And one of the risks that you run when you do something like that is having a model that's so general that it doesn't mean anything. And so we've also done work on thinking about what are the must-haves, what are the things that you have to do in order to do jail transition that's in accordance with the model. You certainly have to have engagement from leadership. I think what we see is that you don't have good, broad reentry efforts take wing unless you've got leadership that supports it, is aware of it, and is pushing it along. We also, and this is true as well of the transition from prison to community project, we're looking at a systems change approach. What we're talking about is not something that is having a reentry program, but building a system that will ensure that all the programs, interventions that you have are having the maximum benefit to the community. This is particularly important for the population coming in and out of jail that turns over very quickly. Less than 20% of people in jail are going to be there for a month or more, so they're in and out very quickly. Most of them come out of the community without any supervision. So you really have to have a system that keeps them engaged in the change activities that you're trying to bring to bear, or it will break down. The jail can't do it on their own. And that comes into the next must-have, which is the joint ownership by jail in the community. So it's not a jail issue, it's not a criminal justice system issue. It's a community issue. And again, this is one that the challenges of working with the rapidly turning over jail population make particularly important. But I think it's just as important with the prison population. And, you know, I do work, although in a more limited role, in the Transition from Prison to Community Initiative. And I think one of the big challenges that those state-level efforts have is really driving down to the individual communities where, you know, a lot of the hard work post-release has to be done. You know, reentry lives or dies by what happens in the local community, and you have to have that joint ownership of the issue in partnership with the community in order to really have long-term success. We guide our sites through a triage approach. We know that resources are limited, and again, people come in and out of the jail very quickly. I think that, you know, when Sheriff Cabral talks about how they're using a full LSIR assessment to everybody coming into our jail, that's really amazing. We know that a lot of our jurisdictions aren't going to be there, so we have them screening using a relatively quick instrument just for risk to reoffend, and then identifying the people who are at their higher risk end, and those are the people that you focus in on for assessment, for case planning, for case management, and to put into your really intensive programming. So you sort of triage and you start working intensively with the people who need the most intervention in order not to reoffend. What you often find in a lot of jurisdictions is that, in essence, people end up in programming who volunteer into the programming, and what that tends to lead you to is a lot of your program resources going towards the most motivated and least likely people to reoffend. And so we try and use the TJC approach to get that turned around. And the final must-have is the use of data, both upfront to inform your strategy, to understand your population and think about making them into groups that you can target in different ways, and also consistent with what Commissioner Martin was saying, to measure progress and make sure that you're having success and improve things that aren't going as well as you would like them to. So real quickly, we've got a lot of variation across our 6 sites in terms of size. In Orange County, we're in one of the 10 largest jail jurisdictions in the country, and it goes down to Douglas and La Crosse County that are, on any given day, have fewer than 200 people in their jail facility. And I want to go through this pretty quickly in the interest of time, but I think it's important to say that the local government roles vary quite a bit across the TJC sites. You have, certainly in Davidson County, which is Nashville, you've got an effort that's really spearheaded by the sheriff, but he sits on a criminal justice steering committee with the mayor, the chief of police, the district attorney, some of the judges that talk about strategy, and TJC is very much a part of their strategy. Now, Denver, the mayor and the city council created the Crime Prevention and Control Commission to overlook a lot of cross-cutting justice system issues, of which reentry was one. And TJC has really been able to come in and build on the work that they had already done. It's also useful to mention Davidson County, which is Nashville and Denver, are unified city-county systems. Our other 4 sites have both a county and municipal government structures. You know, Douglas County created their first criminal justice collaboration around our work and put together an executive council, a sheriff, a county commissioner sit on it, a state representative to do the sort of high-level policy guidance and oversight. Kent County in Michigan, they have a Community Corrections Advisory Board, again, including the county commissioner, the sheriff, and so on, that are doing that high-level guidance. In La Crosse, you know, the local government, we've got one of the county supervisors actually sitting on a core implementation team and walking through the nuts and bolts of developing and executing their strategy. And in Orange County out in California, a lot of what they did, their local probation, county probation had been doing a lot of work on implementing evidence-based practices and really had become a leader on that on the community supervision side. And so they came in, the Sheriff's Department and probation, in collaboration when they applied to be a TJC site so that they could take advantage of, one part of the criminal justice system which had particularly become very strong in their practice and try and then, see if they could meld that strategy with what the Sheriff's Department was doing to increase the benefit of it across the entirety of their system. One thing that I wanted to highlight, and I know we've got a mix of audiences here, funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Urban Institute is putting together, and it's pretty close to done, an elected officials toolkit on jail reentry intended to be sort of the 10,000-foot overview on why jail reentry matters, some tools for elected officials, how they might think through some first steps that they might take in furthering jail reentry work in their jurisdictions. We've got other resources that really lay out the nuts and bolts from different perspectives. This is intended to be more a briefing book to, help elected officials think through the issue, why it matters, and how they might get started on working on it. And this fits in and will be available through our TJC project website, which is right there. We also have Life After Lockup, which is a real overview of the jail reentry issue, a lot of the statistics, why it matters, what we know about it, the Jail Administrator's Toolkit for Reentry, which is particularly looking at it from a jail operations standpoint. And as I mentioned, the TJC Implementation Toolkit, which is entirely web-based, guides you through implementing all the pieces of the TJC model. We'll have policy briefs forthcoming. And again, we intend to use the National Reentry Resource Center as a way to get the word out of these things as they're generated, because just as we're asking the jurisdictions we work with to collaborate better across their system, I think those of us who are doing and trying to get information and resources out at the national level are also trying to practice what we preach and learn how to cooperate better so that we speak with one voice and that, we're getting useful information into everyone's hands as efficiently as we can. And I think with that, I will conclude, and hopefully we can start off the questions.
Great. Yes. Jesse, thank you for that overview. Certainly, we hope this is an example of the collaboration we want to see as we begin to try to connect the materials that have been developed through these national partnerships out further into the field.
Leanne, could I actually, I think one more thing that I would just like to throw in. So our assistance to the TJC sites is technical assistance and evaluation support. We don't bring any money with us, and so all 6 of the jurisdictions that are working on implementing the model, we don't bring resources in the form of money, so they're doing it with either what they have in hand or what they're able to get from other sources. And, so they're going through all of this with the same challenges that I think are facing every other jurisdiction.
Yeah. And I think, when we had some questions come through about, when, all of you have described different aspects of bringing a variety of public and private partners to the table, from county government agencies, informal human service systems, to nonprofit organizations that are working in your communities. Can you talk a little bit about what happens behind those closed doors of those conversations? Can you give us some examples of how, you've crossed a big hurdle and you've gotten folks to come to the table? So what does it look like when they're actually in the room together? How exactly have things changed among those groups to reflect that new degree of collaboration?
Which one would you like to answer?
If whoever feels inspired can jump in. But I'm just curious, because that question comes up a lot, which is, that there's so often, turf wars and past history that prevent partnerships from really thriving. And I'd just be curious to hear, Sheriff Cabral or Commissioner Martin, how y'all have managed to overcome some of those things and actually get into operational collaboration with your partners.
Well, I think we were fairly fortunate here in that the first reentry program that this Sheriff's Department had was the Boston Reentry Initiative, and it was started before I became sheriff. It started in 2001. I became sheriff here in 2002. And the driver for that program was the Boston Police Department. It overcomes a great deal when it's a police department saying, we think this is valuable. It does so much for your advocacy in the community when the police thinks that kind of work is important. It helps them do their job better, and it makes communities safer. So they're always, local police departments and state police are very good voices for getting everyone else to the table, because the feeling is if the police don't have an objection to it, who am I as a legislator or a county commissioner or a not-for-profit organization representative to have an issue with it? And at the end of the day, it really does come down to the advocacy. I think our greatest resistance doesn't come from law enforcement, doesn't actually even come from communities. I mean, Suffolk County is the city of Boston. People can pick up the paper and see what the impact of crime is, or they can feel it with their own property and their own safety. So it's not a NIMBY problem in Suffolk County because the numbers are just so high in terms of people who are incarcerated, and we actually get 28% of all people who are released from DOC, from the Department of Corrections, from state prison, come back to Suffolk County. So the people who live here get it. I think our greatest resistance is sometimes among legislators who, come from places outside of Suffolk County and who don't sort of, crime is not high on their agenda, or they don't want to appear to be soft on crime. So when it comes to funding county sheriff's departments appropriately, or maybe even getting support for funding for things like, the Mass Mentoring Partnership, because, the mentoring can be part of good reentry programs, and you want to keep their budget going well. That's the kind of resistance we get, and that's where we have to really sell it, and we have to make sure that they understand you think crime doesn't affect you, but it absolutely affects you. And it affects your constituents. And so, as Commissioner Martin was saying, it's the advocacy part is crucial, and the stronger the partners' voices are on that, the better off you're going to be, the more successful you're going to be.
And,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
I absolutely agree with the sheriff about the buy-in from local law enforcement. People trust their local police, and if they're comfortable and they see the value in it, and I'll point directly, at least here in this area, if your district attorney, whose main responsibility is to prosecute those and keep them off the streets and keep our community safe, having his buy-in tends to bleed down throughout the ranks of police departments. Having your local sheriff being involved is absolutely a critical component. But the other one's this, especially when you're dealing with state offenders that are coming back to the community. I know here we've had a couple instances, specifically in the area of sex offenders being brought back into the community, and obviously housing, specifically as it pertains to like Megan's Law and things like that, and it really gets people up in an uproar. So what we really try to convey to them is, folks, these people are coming back to our communities after they leave prisons. Would you rather they come back in just an open-door fashion, or would you rather have them come back in an integrated fashion that stabilizes them and just increases the chance that they will be successful? And that's the tack they usually try to take. I'm not going to sit here and say if you try to build a facility, for that you're not going to get tremendous, I call it the pitchforks and torches come out and all that stuff. But I just couldn't agree more with what the sheriff said. Law enforcement, your district attorney's office, your sheriff, having them being a part of this tends to ease the community's comfort level with these initiatives.
And the thing that I would add, from our sites is I think that bringing real data that's specific to the jurisdiction that you're talking about, I think has been extremely helpful. When we started in Douglas County, when they first brought all their stakeholders to the table, what the sheriff's office did is they did a list of, all the people who have been released from the jail or were in the jail over some period, and they sent that around to the homeless shelter, to the community mental health provider, to some of the people doing substance abuse treatment, and said, how many of these people have you seen have been your client in the past year? And gathered that information up, and I think that was really compelling as a place to start the conversation, because you can say a lot of us are seeing the same people, and it's particularly true with jail where people are in and out and they tend to be pinballing through a lot of these systems. but it's different when you put an actual number to it. And, I was yesterday in Nashville at one of their big community meetings, and we've been talking about the principle of targeting your resources to the people who are the highest risk to reoffend. They've just gone through the process of implementing a screener just to tell you risk to reoffend, which is the first time they've ever had that information. They've always done institutional risk, your risk of causing trouble in the jail, but they've never done the risk to reoffend in the community. And now they have that information. When we talk about targeting our high-risk people, here's how many people that is, here's where they are within our system, and that, I think, allows people, it makes it real, and you can start to sort of problem solve and get a sense of what the scope of it is.
Jesse, on that issue of data and bringing David's data to the table as you're having these conversations and reaching out to different stakeholder groups, are there any national repositories of state, county, and local recidivism rates or recidivism data that's out there?
It's a mixed bag. I mean, you've got the Bureau of Justice Statistics. I mean, people have tried to do that. I forget whether it was one of the advocacy groups came out recently with a kind of compendium of recidivism studies by state, but the problem with all of those is then you get into the fine print. It's like, well, this state is counting it different from this state, and so you wonder how compelling it is. And I also think that, in my experience, you can only get so far with national level data. It gets you a little bit, but I think that information that's from the place that you're talking about and from the community that you're talking about is what's really compelling. That's what really gets you into actually talking about what you're going to do.
And in your experience, who is the keeper of that data? If you're not from local government, who do you turn to that's likely to have that information about your county or community?
Well, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear, I think, from the sheriff and the commissioner, because I think they have a lot of it. Particularly, a place like Suffolk County where they've been doing the LSIR, and I mean, I'm sure know a lot about their risks and the issues that are present in their jail population. That's a real struggle for a lot of local jurisdictions. I mean, the state has it for people who are in prison, although in some cases, a DOC will have it for the people who are in the prison. Somebody else will have it, parole or probation, for the community supervision side. Your Department of Labor or Workforce Development Department will know a lot of the employment stuff. That's one of the reasons the system approach is necessary, because that information is kind of spread out in a lot of different places.
And I just want to correct one thing very quickly. The reason we have 3 assessment tools is because we use the LSIR for the women. It's a very labor-intensive thing. We don't have enough staff to do an LSIR on all of the men, because it's a ratio of 1,600 men to maybe 150 women. And we use the substance abuse one for everyone. And we use the internal one that we created for the men, because it's sort of a quicker and dirtier assessment tool. But the LSIR, which I actually think is the best, is also very labor-intensive. And you need time and you need staff to do that, which is why we created a shorter version for our own internal. That said, we keep that information. I think it's just that there's no place to send all of that information for those who keep it, to send it up and have it all sort of put together. And I think a lot of the federal agencies are dependent upon, who submits it and who doesn't. And it gets kind of low on the priority scale when you're running facilities where you're triaging people all the time. That said, I think, it's a good idea to put it all in one place if we can.
And if I can, I was scrolling through the attendees, and I saw Jerry Bartriff, who I work with on Iowa's transition from prison to community effort. That's a state that invested a lot of resources in a unified, in a lot of unified criminal justice system data in this database called ICON. And I mean, the information that they can pull now about not only their state prison, but also their community supervision population is extremely impressive, and they can do all kinds of things in that now. But that was, a multiple year effort to get there.
And once you have data in your hands and you're moving towards a convening or a meeting with your local partners, in y'all's experience, do you have local jurisdictions that have someone that helps coordinate those task forces, or how do those meetings and that planning effort move forward? Can you give some examples of how those are organized and structured?
Where I think you got three overpolite panelists. We don't know when
jump in.
Actually, I kind of got a blip on my phone. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. One of the questions is basically, when you use this data to launch your local community planning processes, how are those planning processes structured? Do you have a person that has been hired to coordinate your reentry task forces and develop local reentry plans, or, do you staff that with staff through other agencies? But how are those partnerships structured so that they turn into to reentry plans for your community?
Well, if you go back to the first slide I had that, with all the pretty circles linked together, we actually have representatives from each of those entities that sit on our what we call a reentry management organization. And they actually together had developed a plan that they actually, which has been tweaked, which is a healthy thing, as we've learned through this process, to then put out an RFP and create what they have called the demonstration project, and which started off with baby steps. And you had a plan that included everything from making sure people had identification. You'd be amazed at how many people walk out the doors of your prisons that don't have a driver's license and don't know where their Social Security card is. All these kind of things that, in many cases, you need to accomplish other things, like sometimes for a job application or whatnot. So they lay out a plan together as that group, and it's laid out through the RFP that people then respond to competitively to meet those needs in so many offenders throughout the year.
I think the idea of a council is an excellent idea. Anytime you can get a coalition of different interests meeting regularly or semi-regularly to make sure that the efforts are being pushed forward, and that people who are new to the process or newly interested in offering services to the process can become part of it. I think that's great. I mean, it's not the way we do it here, primarily because it really does have something to do with the way reentry started here, and because it's the Sheriff's Department has been one of the primary drivers of it, because this is where the population is. But we function well on a community-based basis, and so we can just bring those resources in. But I think for most communities, I think that it's better if you can get exactly what the Commissioner was talking about, buy-in, good leadership and good advocacy from different representatives from all of the stakeholders. And those are the people who are going to make a commitment to stick with it, that are going to consistently speak with one voice and say this is valuable, that it works, and that we need to keep this up. And I think that your community awareness of it and acceptance of it increases exponentially each year that such a committee is in place and is working, and the results of their work is visible.
And for sites that wanted to apply to be in the TJC project, we told them that they needed to tell us who the site coordinator was going to be, and that they needed to commit to have 50% of that person's time. I mean, I think that in addition to that, to really have a collaboration move along, oftentimes you need a staff person who's ready to think about where, things are going and commit. Because, facilitating collaboration is a lot of work. And, what we found, I think, most successful in our sites is if you've got that coordinator, and then you can build a core team around them of people, ideally cross-agency, who are invested and can give time, so that you can spread the work out and, bring multiple perspectives and have that person think out. And then I think you need the top-level folks organized in some way, not to get into the daily details, but to, be guiding things strategically, to be aware of what's going on, to step in when when there are issues that need to be resolved that can only be done at that level, and then to come back, something that Commissioner Martin hit heavily, to do that accountability piece. I mean, they're the ones who really need to be keeping an eye on the measures and making sure, that and asking to make sure that you're getting the outcomes that you're looking for. And I think this is particularly a challenge in smaller jurisdictions. I mean, we've got one of our sites where the person who's coordinating the collaborative effort really also, she's doing that sometimes, and some of the times she's going and doing the actual case planning for the people who are in the jail. Because, in smaller jurisdictions, sometimes, that's the resource reality, and it's extremely challenging.
Shifting from the planning work, can you talk a little bit about the organizations that provide the services? Who are they, and how are they funded?
Oh, here they run the gamut. You can have everything from, clearly state-funded police departments and a sheriff's department that gets an appropriation from the legislature, to organizations like Youth Opportunity Boston or other sort of community-based organizations that rely on grants, essentially, to stay alive, and contributions and donations, to larger foundations that have an endowment that not only have a grant making capability. The Boston Foundation comes to mind. Here, they have a grant making capability. They've also recently got into programming, which is highly unusual for them. I think it's the first time in their history, but they've been doing a program called Street Safe. And so they're always sort of an available partner to come in on any reentry program, and sometimes you look to them also for grants. I think community health centers are a huge potential partner, because they're actually seeing some of the people that are in your programs, but they have mental health services, and, beyond the physical health, they have mental health services. They have, clinics and workshops on sexually transmitted disease. They keep statistics. Your local public health commissions, whether it's in our case, the City of Boston's Health Commission or the Department of Public Health for the state, they're seeing, I think the commissioner made this point, every single one of these groups, whether you're talking about the courts or the prisons, the faith-based groups, the social service groups, county government, we're all seeing the same people. The people that I see as adults, I have people 17 and older, the people that I see in my facility as adults, they were already seen first usually by the Department of Social Services because of some issue or dysfunction in the family, and then the Department of Youth Services when they get into trouble as juveniles, and now they're seen by the criminal justice system. And it's not that we don't know who they are and don't have the information. It's that all of the agencies who either touch their lives or have the potential to touch their lives. If you're talking about Mass Mentoring Partnership or any Big Sisters, we brought the Amachi program in here, which is based out of Philadelphia, that assigns a big brother or big sister to the children of incarcerated parents. It requires you to have them come into your facility and get the primary caretaker information from the actual inmate. And we thought we'd have a huge amount of resistance to that, and we ended up having an overwhelming number of people want to participate because while the person's in jail, someone else is taking care of their child. And to assign that child a big brother or big sister, that is a form of reentry programming. Changing your visitation room in the House of Correction for the parents, particularly the mothers, to a more child-friendly environment helps to kind of facilitate some sort of family unification because someone is going to bring that child in to see the parent. And that's probably someone with whom the incarcerated person has some tension. And there's issues of dysfunction in the family. But even a small thing like creating a more positive environment for that visitation and for some conversation to be facilitated is a good thing, and it's a start. I mean, so I think that I don't think anyone should discount any potential help from any group from any quarter. Because I think, more times organizations and law enforcement and others have a lot more to give than people think. And once you start the ideas going, you can really sort of build on it. That's why I said, you don't have to start big. You can start small, but as long as you start something. And I think there's really no end. There's a million service providers out there. There's a million not-for-profits out there. You just have to focus them on the needs of this particular population and help them to see how being a part of it helps their budget, because they're able to apply for more grants because they're working with you and they're able to apply for them in collaboration with you. We do a lot of that. We don't pay anybody or very few people to come in, but we'll provide a letter of support for your grant, and we'll say that you're working with our population and that the work you do is important to us and it saves the taxpayers money. That helps them get money to sustain their entire organization.
You had mentioned, Sarah, some work that you had done with families, particularly with women. Have you worked with any mediation programs or family mediation programs, or do you know of examples of places that have that type of service integrated into their reentry efforts?
We don't do that here, although I've been looking at some form of restorative justice for a while. Our budget's been cut every single year for the last 4 fiscal years, so I've been sort of hanging on to the programs that we already have and not focusing on not cutting those. But I think restorative justice programs are a good outlet for something like that, and especially if you do it in the context of community transition. Some restorative justice programs have representatives of the community, usually a faith-based organization representative, community activists, neighborhood crime watch folks who work in conjunction with the Sheriff's Department, the releasing agency, and the Boston Police to sort of say, to have people even come before them or come into the institution and see them just before they're released to say, we know you're coming back into the community. We're welcoming you back, but we're also aware of the impact you've had on this community previously, and you're not going to be able to do that anonymously anymore. We're willing to help you, but you have to be willing to help yourself. There are components of family mediation that you can integrate into restorative justice programs. We just are not at the point financially where we're able to do that right now, but I've been considering it actually for a number of years because I think that's a big part of transition back into community.
That's definitely a component that I think was more stronger in the juvenile justice side previously. We are starting to see around this way that some of those same organizations are now looking at a whole new market, and that is working with obviously adult offenders and their victims. But I definitely echo the sheriff's comments in regards to funding at this very point. But it seems like that people are catching on. It's amazing. I come out of working in the juvenile justice system, and we all know that system is more about rehabilitation, treatment, and supervision. And historically, the adult system is about time. And though the adult system will continue to be about time, there definitely needs to be a movement towards the rehabilitation, treatment, and supervision. You're going to see more entities that are starting to be able to meet those needs in the community.
I know that there's an organization that's community mediation in Maryland is working, I think at both some of the state and I think some of the local facilities in and around Baltimore, and they're sending in trained mediators and working specifically around mediation of family issues. I have some information on that. I saw them presented at a conference, and then I can send that on to you, Leanne, if you want to provide that to either everybody or the specific person who asked that question.
Great. Thank you. If you're interested in information about family mediation, I would ask that you would email me directly so that I can connect to the resources that Jesse has just described. And I just put my email address up in the chat box, but it's lduran, LDURAN, @csd.org. And with that, we are about out of time for today's webinar. So I wanted to give the presenters a chance to provide any last couple of seconds closing remarks, and then we'll come back together and I'll let you know how to get the slides and the archived webinar on our website.
The only thing I would say in closing is I see some of the questions coming up, and someone had asked for our internal assessment tool. Anything like that that's needed, I'm happy to provide that to you and Sean, and if they can sort of attach it to the webinar so people can maybe download it like they do the PDFs of the PowerPoints. I'm happy to provide that so you guys can just let me know what it is that people are asking for, and we'll give it to you.
I concur. If anyone needs any information, I know I didn't have a presentation more in depth about the programming that the sheriff covered more the role that I did here. But if anyone's interested in what we're doing here in Lancaster County with our reentry management group, or to answer the question, we do have a Lancaster Area Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, which we just answered with the last question. I'd be more than happy to try to get as much information as I can on it. But thank you very much for your time. It was great not only listening to the other panelists, but also the great questions. And thank you to NACO and the National Reentry Resource Center for pulling this together.
Ditto. Excellent job, guys.
And I'd like to echo what Sheriff Cabral was saying about starting small. I think that when you look at the places that are doing really excellent reentry work at any level, those are things that built over many years. Suffolk County didn't start doing what they were doing overnight, and we couldn't be doing the good work that we're doing in the TJC sites if it weren't for, the things that they started and built prior to our coming there. So, I think that if you don't have anything, think about something small that you can start and get going, and it will grow if you're successful.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for your attendance, and also thank you so much to our presenters. Again, they're Dusty Janetta from the Urban Institute Justice Policy Center, Sheriff Cabral from Suffolk County, Massachusetts, and Commissioner Martin from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I also did want to mention we're very fortunate to have our work around local governments and jail reentry be guided by a whole committee of people. We're so fortunate that this work is being chaired by the National Association of Counties, and who's been a great partner with us on this work. And so I wanted to make sure that we thanked them for the work that went up in planning and pulling our presenters together. A recording of the presentation and the slides will be available online in the next few days at www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. And finally, when you leave this event, you'll be asked to take a brief survey on the webinar. We would very much appreciate your feedback and look forward to you joining us again for future webinars in the National Reentry Resource Center. Thank you very much.